my name is Daniel Crawford, host of the Inequality Chronicles. Today's stories. R2-D2 took my job. Standard & Poor examines standards for the poor. Urban stall. Hands up, don't shoot, help. The first story, R2-D2 took my job. I know that was an awkward segue, wasn't it? Anyways, the article's title, Robots May Disrupt Half of All U.S. Jobs. The source is U.S. News & World Report. Author is Tom Risen, and the date of its publishing was August 18th. The bullet points. A poll of scientists and other analysts found that those polled are almost equally divided about whether the ever-increasing use of robots will help create enough jobs to replace the ones killed as a result of automation. And it was emphasized that those same people were quite alarmed about how slow our educational system has been to prepare young people for these changes. U.S. News did point out, however, that doomsday predictions related to the rise of robots in the workforce have been around since the 1980s. A report from Oxford University warned that up to half of all American jobs are in danger in the next 2 decades, with much of that impact ongoing and continuing in the manufacturing sector, and expanding into several areas of the service sector. Yet another report found that about a quarter of the world's workforce, those in manufacturing, will be caught in the crossfire as robotics lays siege upon us. Excuse me. So, what you have here is there's another story which, in essence, deals with this broadening gap between the rich and poor. And as you hear in the article, for decades there's been this fear campaign against any effort at improving the conditions for the working people by constantly saying, well, your job's not going to be there for you for forever because robotics are coming along and they're going to take your job anyway. So might as well be happy with what you have. And in some respects, that may be true. You know, some of the better paying jobs and manufacturing jobs are getting replaced by robotics, and they're even trying to bring it into, grocery stores. I work at one, so I see it. We have these self-checkouts, and although we get a lot of complaints from customers about how much of a hassle it is to deal with them, people do go to them as a last resort because they get frustrated waiting in lines. Of course, they go wait in another line to go to the very machine that they thought they would be able to avoid waiting in line for to begin with, but that's another issue altogether. Either way, this is a part of that fear campaign. And a lot of this is coming up again as we have this big debate about minimum wage being increased up to the measly $10.10 here in the United States, when it really should be advocated to raise it up to a living wage of $15 or $20 an hour. See, if anything, as we've discussed before on this show, $10.10 an hour is more than a compromise. It's the working people being willing to give themselves a shaft for another 5-10 years as we continue to wait for another pathetic increase in minimum wage. And all these increases don't even keep up with the rate of inflation, but that's besides the point. The point is this: the whole issue about robots taking your jobs is a fear tactic. And you know it is. So, yeah, jobs all across the planet are being endangered by robotics. And, there's this theory, they've always saying, always claiming that, okay, well, it's not going to be the end of everything because you'll be able to have the possibility of, progression in the economy. People will be able to become more productive. And that, in theory, is true. But we're not working with that type of economy now, are we? What we are dealing with is reality, not theory. And in reality, the wealthiest, as I will be discussing later, are looking for their bottom line. And if robotics helps them forward their bottom line, they're not going to look to make people more productive. They're just going to try to look to maintain the status quo, but at a cheaper rate. Meaning, not replace a human with a human, but a human with a robot. And the more they can do that and get away with it, oh great! Problem is, you do that enough, what's going to happen to your consumer base? If you don't have enough humans making enough money to become consumers, where's the consumption going to come from? Because in the end, that model, through attrition, reduces the number of consumers you have, which I would assume means you have less profit over time, unless I'm crazy. Anyways, story number 2. Standard & Poor examines standards for the poor. Article's title is S&P Wealth Gap is S&P Wealth Gap is slowing U.S. economic growth. Source is CNBC. The author is, an unknown author from the Associated Press, and the date of its publishing was August 5th. The bullet points. Standard & Poor now says that the extreme condition of economic inequality in this country is making our economy more prone to boom and bust cycles. As a result of the disparity of wealth distribution, S&P trimmed its projections for economic growth for the year ahead, but they are strongly advising against using tax reform to correct the issue. Instead, they recommend a greater investment in education, estimating that an additional year of school for each worker could permit the economy to grow by a half percentage point more. Together, with the CBO and IMF, it is warned that inequality exacerbates the economy by forcing citizens to rely more on debt to make ends meet. Duh. I mean, you have one section of the economy who never really have to worry about anything, except for a mildly higher tax bill they could probably dodge anyways through all the tax loopholes that exist for the upper part of our society. For what it's worth, the lower end of our society, the poor like myself, we have a lot of deductions and credits that we could benefit from as well. But at the same time, that enables us to actually just get by, to survive, if you're playing by all the right rules. People who lie their way through things probably can live high on the hog, but for those of us who play honestly, all these tax credits do just enable you to get by. It enables you to be able to pay rent for a few months or get caught up on your bills. And the S&P is, they're trying to have it both ways here. They're trying to say, well, economic equality is going to be a threat to the economy. But please do not touch the tax code. Do not make the rich pay their fair share to balance things out. That's terrifying. Gotta remember what the S&P is. Consider the source here. Yeah, they have a point in saying that education is key, but it is not the only key. At the end of the day, how are you going to pay for education? Tax reform would enable us to put more money into education. After all, if you want to increase spending and opportunities in education, where's that money going to come from? The people who already don't have enough to pay, the only ones who are actually paying their so-called fair share. I mean, the poor end of society can't afford to pay any taxes, unfortunately. In fact, the tax credits we get enable us to just barely get by, as I just mentioned. But the upper end, the upper class, they hardly pay any themselves because they have all these tax loopholes they're able to capitalize on. The middle class, they don't have all those resources to turn to dodge taxes left and right. So at the end of the day, they are stuck with the bill. It's time to even that playing field. So S&P, you got to suck it up. Eventually, the people at the top end are going to have to pay their fair share. So yeah, we need education reform. We need more investment in education. But someone needs to pay for it. And it's about damn time that the people at the top lend a hand to pave the way for a brighter, more prosperous future. Story number 3. Urban Stall. Article's title, What Recovery? How Poverty is Moving to Suburbs. The source is CNBC. Author is John W. Schoen. And the date of its publishing was August 4th. The bullet points. The Brookings Institution found that the recession hurt the suburbs tremendously, with the greatest increases in poverty being concentrated therein, especially in areas where poverty was already a big issue. Reversing the gains made in the 1990s, the recession actually helped a number of suburbs, which took longer to climb out of the pit during those nostalgic boom times, become more downtrodden than the cities they neighbored. Suburban poverty skyrocketed during the 2000s by 105%, while those figures jumped a meager, by comparison, 21% in the cities, and the South was the worst hit. Ultimately, as the article concludes, this steep decline into deep poverty only condemns the areas and the future generations inhabiting such to a prolonged, perpetually reinforced cycle of life on society's bottom rung. So, we have this trend wherein the economy just gets weaker and weaker with each recession, as each recession brings about a new jobless recovery. At least this has been the case with each recession and recovery cycle since the Reagan years. We are living in the era of Reaganomics, trickle-down economics, this philosophy suggesting that the only way to respond to economic crises is with tax cuts, and that somehow increasing taxes to pay for the incentives you provide to help bring the economy back up, that somehow increasing taxes is somehow the devil. And of course, it also, during this era, we've seen a contraction of all efforts to try and put more spending into the economy to boost it. So it's all supposed to be financed through tax cuts. Just cut your way out of a recession. Yeah, because in the right-wing part of our ideological spectrum here is, very much in favor of cutting taxes and cutting spending, because that makes a lot of sense. Of course, the original spokesman for the right-wing philosophy, like the original economic spokesman, like Milton Friedman, who a lot of them, whether or not they realize it, they take after. He himself wasn't completely against what John Maynard Keynes said, regarding what you need to do when you have economic crises. But the reality is you have this far right-wing takeover of the Republican Party, and it is just dragging that party into crazy land, for a lack of a better expression. And you have this worsening recession recovery cycles. Each recovery gets weaker, and granted, during the Clinton years we had boom, but at the same time, I remember as a kid during the 1990s seeing cartoons saying, look, talk about how many jobs President Clinton was presiding over being created, and then comment on the cartoon was, and I have 3 jobs. Which of course emphasized the fact that they needed 3 jobs to be able to get by. And the reality is that it's because, jobs are getting created, but each recovery is not able to replace the jobs that were lost with jobs that are just as good. You keep losing good jobs over time. Now granted, during President Obama's tenure, we've seen some manufacturing jobs come back, but not enough. And that's why you see this outcry demanding for increase in the minimum wage. And I'm tempted, as a partisan, as a Democrat, to say it's not entirely President Obama's fault. But the president does have a share of the blame here. He has a share of the blame because he wanted to placate the right-wing part of the spectrum just a little bit too much. Wanted to feed into this belief of theirs that tax cuts are an absolute part of the issue. So the recovery in 2009 relied too heavily on tax cuts to achieve the objective. And what we ended up with was a significantly more sluggish recovery, because it was underemphasizing spending, overemphasizing tax cuts. Should have been a much smaller percentage on that end. Then again, why did we even need any more tax cuts? The previous 8 years under Bush had seen at least 2 massive waves of tax cuts, in addition to all the deficit spending that had been done. Despite the fact that the economy, up until the recessions, between recessions during the Bush years, the economy was growing. And yeah, it was growing at a very bad rate, but still, it was still growing. And in all honesty, we should have seen a reversal of the tax cuts, but no, we didn't. And a part of that deficit spending, which of course wasn't included in the deficit for whatever reason, were the 2 wars that Bush initiated. So, in effect, President Obama inherited this terrible situation where you had massive debts to begin with prior to the recession, and they were growing every year. And then had the recession, it reduced the amount of tax revenue and required us to do spending to get us out, and in their minds required more tax cuts. If anything, they should have just dispensed with the idea of tax cuts, just extended what did exist at the time, and just put all that money, every dime that they spent should have just been put towards the economy, spending, like direct spending. But that's not what they did. So in reality, because we forgot Keynesian economics and what has worked in the past, conveniently forgot it, and we wanted to placate the right wing who have been religiously loyal to the failed economics policies, we have ended up with this: a worsening recovery, a situation where the safe haven for people all over the country who wanted to escape, for lack of a better phrase here, wanted to escape black people, basically. They wanted to escape, urban communities, which they saw as getting increasingly darker, and they want to go to the suburbs, put themselves in gated communities. But now, a lot of these suburbs are declining in their wealth. They're getting poorer. Wonder why that is. It's because our economy is not healthy right now. It's obvious that something's wrong, and you and I both know what is wrong. Final story number 4. Hands up, don't shoot, help. The article's title: Protest over Michael Brown's death in Ferguson show America's struggle with inequality. The source is The Guardian. The author is Suzanne McGee, and the date of its publishing was August 19th. The bullet points: the turmoil in Ferguson and in divided communities across the country, which is boiling over in the wake of Michael Brown's death, can be indirectly linked to economic justice, since the opportunities to wind up in a position of power and authority are more available to the white community than to the less fortunate minorities. African Americans, more specifically, are less likely to graduate from high school on time than the nation as a whole, less likely to graduate college, more likely to be poor, and have a higher financial burden in covering their essential expenses. White families are likely to be 20 times as wealthy as African Americans, with the former multiplying every dollar they earn by 5 times, and the latter losing 31 cents for every dollar they earned. In the end, the article's author uses the words of one billionaire who pointed to revolutions of the past, which serve as a caveat to those ignoring this pattern. Revolutions, he said, come gradually and then suddenly. One day, somebody sets himself on fire, then thousands of people are in the streets, and before you know it, the country is burning. Important historical lessons are being ignored every day. Now, you've seen some of the media frenzy over Ferguson die down over the past week, as the riots have seemingly dissipated. And soon, within the next week or two, this will become a distant memory for whatever reason, politically speaking. But we the people should not let ourselves forget that what happened in Ferguson is sort of emblematic of something that's going on across the country. I mentioned this during the last episode, that there is inequality of justice in this country just as much as there is an inequality politically and economically. But the inequality of justice more affects minorities than what it does any other group. And obviously it affects the poor, but within the poor it is more about minorities. Now you walk in to a courtroom or you stand before a police officer who's accusing you of something. If you have darker skin, you're highly more likely to have a very bad day. And a lot of this stems back to the injustices that have been done to minorities of the country, particularly African Americans, who were forced to come here. They were enslaved. At least their ancestors were forced to come here. Many of their ancestors were. And when we freed them, we didn't really give them a chance to acclimate. We didn't give them a chance to thrive. No, from the very get-go, once they were freed, people both in the South and in the North did everything they could to stand in their way. Because although on paper they were seen as equal, in our minds and our culture, they were never accepted as equal. And even now, today, they're not. And you know it. You and I both know it. And this stems back to economic inequality, because if any group of people is an example of what's going wrong with this country, it's what's happening with the African American community. It is a scientific sample, it seems, of what's going on in the broader picture here. Mostly in the United States, well, I can't even say mostly in the United States, but the United States and in the world as a whole. The most impoverished on this planet are exploited. And we're going to talk about that here momentarily. So yeah, these issues need to be dealt with. One of the reasons why stuff like affirmative action is actually still necessary, because these injustices have a long way to go before they are corrected. Alright, to recap. The favorite boogeyman for opponents of the minimum wage standard has made a comeback as dire predictions about the workforce being replaced by an army of machines come to the forefront, with threats that about half the American workers and a quarter of the globe's manufacturing sector will be erased from the payrolls. Wall Street investors, via S&P, have calculated that income inequality isn't going to pay off for the economy overall in the long run, though they stop short of endorsing all efforts to address such, because the idea of tax reform to correct the imbalance is unacceptable to them, so they advocate for more education investment instead. Contrary to what used to be the norm when the suburbs were the promised land for affluent whites to flee when their cities got too dark for their liking, the suburbs have increasingly become more of a bottomless pit for the impoverished to be left to starve. As the world watches the events unfold in Ferguson, Missouri, it is important to remember that these miscarriages of justice and hints of racism can be traced back to the economic inequality of white and black America. In the end, the disparity in opportunities determines who makes policies, who enforces the law, and who holds the enforcers accountable when they overstep. Alright, a few updates. At least one update. This is the last time I will be recording this show on a weekly to bi-weekly basis. From this point on, it will be on a monthly basis. If I see articles that pique my interest within that time frame, maybe at the very most of bi-weekly again, but I doubt it. I want to have the highest quality stories available for the show for your viewing. I don't want you to be bored with seeing this. I think that this information is important. So here I am. You're not likely to not see me again with this show until the beginning of October. And then so forth and so on in that pattern. So there you have it. It's an update. But with that, close with the mic check. Today I've been contemplating seriously the reality of our situation. You see, I work at a grocery store. Granted, it wasn't my first choice. When I was a temp, I just got tired of basically being a slave. I got tired of always having to wait by my phone, waiting for another phone call telling me that I had another assignment to go to. Got tired of desperately looking for a means to be able to pay for my bills and make sure I had a roof over my head and the heads of my kids. It was a reckless way to live. But honestly, I did what I had to do at the time, and I'm doing that same thing right now as a cashier. I'm frustrated at the moment because I would desperately love to be full-time. I'm struggling to stay above water as it is. And like every week I have to struggle to even get up to 30 hours if I'm lucky. Yeah, and that's just, the thing is, I actually like where I work. I like the people I work with, I like the customers I work with. And I don't even begrudge my managers, specifically. Because at the end of the day, they're taking orders from on high. And I don't want to mention any names here specifically. But this is a frustrating thing, and I know it's not just me who's experiencing this. It's part of the reason why the demands for minimum wage being increased are increasing. Why it's escalating here. And it needs to continue escalating. We need to keep holding the fire to their feet. You kind of watch the stock market and hear these reports of the wealthy getting wealthier more and more in this country, and the rest of us just either stagnating or even getting poorer. You watch all these reports and you can't help but feel this sick feeling in your stomach. You know that you're sick to your stomach because what you see is legalized theft. Make no mistake about it. These people at the top are only wealthy because we let them be wealthy. They are only rich because we allow them to take the money that we work hard to make for them and hoard it for themselves. We allow them to get away with that. So, what are you going to do about it? Something has to change. And it's not going to change by us just begging for Congress to take action. We have to keep the pressure on. Come together. Speak out. Speak up. Be civilly disobedient. Something. We have to do something to correct these injustices. Because you heard it in that last article there at the very end. The warning of revolution. If you do not think it could come here, you just don't know your history. You don't understand the nature of human beings, who are in effect just animals. We are. We're animals who have managed to learn how to speak to one another in what we think is a more advanced way than other animals. I don't know any other animals who, exploit resources in the same manner that we do and allow their companions to starve to death just so they can continue to hoard everything for themselves. Maybe there are other animals like that, but I don't know. The thing is, even if there are, we're better than that, aren't we? We've come this far as a species, so what's the point if we just keep doing things the way we are? This is our wealth. You and I. And I am addressing the bottom rung of society. The bottom 99%. We are the real job creators. We create this wealth run. We bust our ass to make it. We're letting the top get away with our money and keep it for themselves. Why should we tolerate one more day of this? I'm about to go over my self-allotted time, but in this one instance, I don't care. Because the reality is, something has to be done. Do you want to continue living this way? Is it okay to keep living this way? Is it okay to allow wealth to continue to be concentrated into the hands of a few? Because with that wealth concentration also comes the ability to collect more political power, which in effect reinforces their ability to concentrate more wealth in their hands. It's this feeding cycle here. So what are you going to do about it? And I intentionally chose to make sure this video was recorded and published on Labor Day. It was recorded the day before, but it's going to be published on Labor Day. And for anyone who knows their history, Labor Day is not just... Yeah, like I said, I'm going over a little bit. Labor Day is not just some celebration of the worker. There's a reason we celebrate workers in America and in the world. Because the people who came before us, in the early 1900s and before that, throughout the 1800s, through actual blood, sweat, and tears, fought for us to have the labor rights that we do have. For us to have the right to organize. For us to have a weekend, overtime, minimum wage, child labor laws, safety standards, heck, even unemployment insurance, Social Security, all these things that we take for granted. These people fought and even died for in some cases. Because they had to. Otherwise, we would have been working pretty much all day, every day of our lives. And our children would be too, dying in a factory somewhere if they didn't speak up. I mean, before organized labor got together, just do your research. Look at how horrifying the working conditions were. There were no protections for the working person. You were basically enslaved by your employer, who got to pay you as little as they wanted to, work you as often as they wanted to. So you can hope for crumbs? Are we really going to forget all of that? Labor Day 2014 needs to be a revival of our spirit. Like I said before, they're stealing from us. They are taking our money and they are taking advantage of us. They are taking our democracy from us. Get angry about this. Because, like that saying goes, and I'm applying it to your rights here as a worker, with the right to organize, with your right to speak up, and as a voter, with your right to vote. If you don't use it, you lose it. And that's precisely what the wealthy in this country and throughout this planet are counting on. Is you not using this opportunity, what is left of this opportunity, to avert catastrophe. Ask yourself, do you want an oligarchy? Do you want to be forced to live on scraps? Because if you think that backing off, making the government back off from these wealthy individuals, if you think that that's going to make it to where they're going to start paying you more, offering you more hours, no! You're living in this fantasy world. If you think that by making the government step back that that's going to create more opportunities, no. Because if that was the case, the deregulations of the past 30 years should have been providing a huge, unprecedented boom. But over time, over these years, the wealth gap has only gotten worse. I mean, we have to do something. And The time is running out. So, now that I've droned on and on here, I want you to get this message. It's time to act. It's time to speak up. It's time to demand accountability. It's time that we the people took our country back and made the economy and our political system and our justice system work for us. Thank you. Power to the people. Which, if you're not familiar with it, is pretty much the essence of democracy. Which is basically Greek for people power. Thank you. See you next month.